In the 70s and 80s, Mary and I, along with our Methodist congregation, were very active in working with Heifer Project. Heifer Project is a hunger agency who supplied livestock to needy families around the world. And in '87, I was asked to take a trip to take a load of livestock to Guatemala. And I'd like to share these notes with you. I wrote these notes as I was returning home from Guatemala City to LA. On 9 October 1987, I realized a dream of many years when I became a Heifer Project International cowboy. Frank Miller from Ohio and I were invited to accompany a load of livestock for Heifer Project International, departing Miami, Florida, with destination Guatemala. After being delayed for a day due to a strike in Guatemala, we finally got 25 goats, 23 sheep, and 12 rabbits loaded aboard a DC-8 with barely enough room left for our small amount of luggage. Frank and I were beginning to think we might have to ride in the livestock pen on board, but we were assured there were 2 seats saved for us. After a 2.5-hour flight, sitting forward of the cargo and slightly after the crew, we arrived rather firmly on the runway of Guatemala City. We immediately became aware that ours was not a routine shipment, for when the cargo door was opened and the flatbed elevator vehicle was rolled into place, puzzled expressions replaced the former business-as-usual smiles on the faces of officials and cargo handlers. For instead of easily offloaded crates, there were 48 assorted individual goats and sheep loose in open pens, sitting approximately 20 feet above the ground in the aircraft. Some interesting conversations ensued as various air cargo, government, and airport officials questioned the 2 Heifer Project cowboys with, "What is your plan for unloading?" We finally convinced them that we neither had a plan nor had access to any equipment suitable for that project. Our cowboy reputation was not really put to test, for about this time, Edgar Fuentes, the Central American Heifer Project representative, arrived with a contingent of various sized trucks and several livestock handlers. Since the problem had been resolved, Frank and I were escorted to customs for landing permits, tourist passes, and other official negotiations. After about an hour, we had completed all necessary paperwork and returned to the perimeter fence to watch the animals being offloaded. Very strict security measures were in effect, and once we departed the cargo area, we were not allowed back into the airport ramp area. The distance of about a city block from where we were standing did lend a bit to the enjoyment and little amusement of watching 2 or 3 animals being loaded into a wire cage-like basket, about 4 feet square. Each animal was then escorted by a livestock handler down the forklift rail, across the tarmac, and then loaded into a waiting truck. The shouts of encouragement from fellow workers, the baas of the sheep, the bleat of the goats, the din of the aircraft arriving and departing, certainly afforded quite a background symphony for this unusual circus. The animals all seemed content and appeared to accept our usual handling as par for the course. I guess by now they could be considered world travelers. Once the livestock were all loaded and on their way to a new home, Edgar Fuentes and his secretary, Frank Miller, and I started up the highway to what would develop into a most memorable visit in northwest Guatemala. We enjoyed about 2 hours of daylight driving and sightseeing through the lower mountain route. I was most impressed by all the corn growing just about everywhere, from the valley floor up to the top of the mountains, and everywhere in between. It appeared that corn is the undisputed #1 crop in this part of the world. About midway on our trip to Quetzaltenango, we stopped for our evening meal at a rural cafe. We had scrambled eggs, beans, tortillas, and coffee. We soon discovered that in these rural areas, eggs, beans, tortillas, and coffee are staple items and may be the menu for all meals. While at this cafe, we were introduced to a group of men who work with the Guatemalan Agriculture Ministry. The spokesman of the group was Dr. Alfonso Llorca, Vice Minister of Agriculture. He is a friend of Heifer Project, very conscious of the people's needs in the area. And before becoming Vice Minister, he served as a coordinator of the Heifer Project International Southwest Region Committee. I was very impressed and deeply pleased to experience government officials exhibiting concern, cooperation, and friendship. Politics were not in evidence. Early Saturday morning, the 10th of October, we met Mr. Adam Vega, coordinator of the Agriculture Southwest Committee. 5 of us loaded into his small Isuzu four-wheel drive vehicle and started out on our first in-country tour. We joked a bit about how the rough highway frequently rearranged our seating. But little did we realize that we were experiencing the smoothest road of the day. After about 2 hours, we passed through the town of San Marcos, which is a major city and marketplace for this rural province. I noticed that as we traveled further into the rural mountains, more and more people recognized Mr. Vega and waved, smiled, and attempted to personally greet him. It was obvious that he was a very popular and positive influence among the world people. And I was also dramatically aware of the road again. After leaving San Marcos, we were suddenly on the roughest road I have ever experienced anywhere in the world. The road is high in the mountains, very well surveyed and engineered for grade and design. It is also a hard surface highway consisting of rock from 1 centimeter to 100 centimeters, randomly arranged to resemble a relief map of extreme gradient terrain. It was bone-rattling, eyeball-jittering, gut-thumping rough. The scenery along the route was absolutely beautiful, with sunshine, wispy clouds, green farms, dozens of sheep and goats grazing, campesinos working, lines of shrubs covered with colorful drying laundry like a patchwork quilt. This collage of peace and life in the Guatemalan islands is forever etched in my memory as an indelible record of this travel experience. And this was certainly the only way we were able to record this trip, for all hands were employed in trying to keep in some upright position as we bounced and crunched our way up the mountain road. Cameras were useless. Perhaps it was a blessing that cameras were useless on this trip through the Guatemalan countryside, for had time been spent adjusting and focusing for that perfect picture, much would have been missed. It was Market Saturday in the country, and many were headed for the nearest town to sell their produce and to buy their necessities for a coming week. And most of this travel was by people power. The roads, trails, and barely discernible paths were sparsely occupied, yet there was a sense of the total society on the move. The women dressed in brightly colored garments and carrying various produce, supplies, and probably the day's nourishment on their heads, weaved their way along the steep and rough trails toward the road to market. Many carried, in addition to the cargo on their head, loads of firewood, corn, banana leaves, fresh fruit, and some carried a baby in their arms. However, most of the babies and very small children were carried by the girls 8 to 12 years old. The boys of that age were occupied with helping carry green fodder, large sticks of firewood, rough-hewn lumber, and an occasional piglet or lamb. The men were nearly covered by the load of corn on their or other green fodder they carried on their back. A few men led small, thin pack horses or a cow. The description of the activity along the Guatemalan countryside almost sounds like a carnival or parade. This is not the reality, however, for behind the occasional smile, or a friendly wave of a hand not occupied on a load. There was that bland, nearly exhausted expression of resignation to a life of drudgery. Little joy and no hope. What a tragedy. Here, as in many parts of the world, in this absolutely beautiful setting, poverty and hunger have slashed deep into the lives of the people. A poverty that scars, disfigures, and in some instances seems to exorcise the humanness from God's people. After a couple of hours traveling along this rocky road, we turned off into a driveway across a pasture of well-maintained sheep farm. We arrived at the Sheep Production Center in Sergio. The center facility belongs to the government, is managed by Fundap, and receives livestock and support from Heifer Project. The Dorset rams that Frank and I accompanied will be used to cross with the native Chura sheep, producing a vigorous offspring to be given to the local farm families. Also at this breeding center, we observed the classrooms where sheep production and care were taught. Mr. Vega had printed some training workbooks using articles and diagrams patterned along some of our animal science texts, but adapted to the local conditions. The local people working and learning at the center were quite exuberant and exuded a real sense of gratitude for this new dimension in their lives. I call it hope. As we continued our travels even further up the mountainside, the road seemed to smooth out a little, even though the terrain was more severe. Perhaps the greeting we received at the school in Tacona and the sparkle of hope in the eyes of the people there rendered the rough spots in the roads insignificant. Edgar Fuentes' secretary interpreted the description of the activity conducted here high in the mountains of Guatemala. And I can't explain it any better than in her report, and so some of her report. The community was assisted by CAPS. HPI helped through the Agricultural Southwest Committee with 24 sheep that it received from Digespi as a payment of the donation. Sheep and wool were declining in their use because of the economic situation of the country. Now the new way to sheep production has allowed a rehabilitation that is looking for getting rural families organized to improve the food and financial resources deficiencies, using sheep to produce wool and to make use of its meat. As a substructure, they have constructed the classroom, and they will build the health center soon. In livestock area beside the sheep, they have begun with rabbits to get protein, organic material, and better incomes. Tacona is in risk because in that area there is an eruptive volcano. However, the community continues working with faithfulness. The adequate coordination of organizations and organized communities allow the development of positive projects. The community organization within good leadership watch over the development of whole projects, and that is vital in all process. CAP's presence in Heifer Project Livestock Committee through Adam Vega contributes to the association of organizations. The summary of cooperative effort described in this last paragraph of the above report pretty well targets my overall impression of Heifer Project International assistance and involvement in Guatemala. Each different project area appeared to sincerely to subscribe to the concept of cooperatio. One of the stops along our road was the Agriculture Training School, where some of our HPI animals were in quarantine before being given to farm families. We were warmly welcomed by Jose Villatoro, director of the school, and Mr. Pablo Cabrera, professor. A highlight was meeting the professor's wife and 2 young daughters, and joining our morning coffee break in their home. A little side story. The girls the day before had taken their pet goat and got her all ready to meet the American visitors. It was a black nanny goat, and they had painted her horns bright red with red fingernail polish. So that was kind of cute idea. We enjoyed that one. Again, strong cooperation existed here as we observed HPI animals from the U.S. being transported by Alianza, furnishing quarantine and learning facilities, all to ultimately see the livestock placed with individual Campesino families. Our last stop on our road through Guatemala was a visit to Saginaw, where we observed individual Campesino families, many headed by widows because of past violence, surviving and beginning to realize a better life through agriculture progress. As we climbed the steep hillside, we could observe firsthand the beautiful corn crop, the beans, squash, and grasses being grown with improved methods. And at each small farmstead, we saw HPI gifts of chickens, goats, and sheep being raised in elevated stable pens. All family members seemed to take genuine pride in pulling handfuls of fresh grass and feeding the well cared for animals, their animals. As we stood at the top of the mountain in a small opening in the corn jungle, there was an uplifting sense of life. And as I gazed into the lens of my Canon camera, trying to get all 7 or 8 smiling youngsters in focus, I spotted that all-pervading glimmer in their eyes, that bright gleam that results from knowing someone really cares. A couple of times during our brief travels in Guatemala, Frank and I asked about their freedom of actions and how they felt about some of their government's policies. They responded with brief, honest answers, but both Edgar Fuentes and his secretary emphasized that their work was with the people in need, and they simply put their trust in God. Paul Jansen, a longtime HPI supporter and a Madeira dairyman, told me before I left on this trip I would never be the same again after this experience. He was right. Jesus said, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter answered, "You know I do." Jesus said, "Then if you truly love me, feed my lambs." How blessed I have been to participate in such joyful experiences associated with Effort Project International. From feeding our Suffolk lambs in California to observe the immersion of our less fortunate brothers and sisters in Central America. Nourishment by time and talent so freely given by so many. The road is sometimes rocky. The road is sometimes barely discernible. The road is many-forked. The road is not always the most popularly traveled. The road does not ever end, but rather it may have many rest stops along the way. For me, these resting areas have been the many lives that have been helped by others' giving. They all shine brightly in the eyes of the recipients, and yes, also in the eyes of the givers. In bright letters, they are all the same. They spell hope.